Good morning. Our goal today is to provide you with an overview of the process and procedures you will need to know to be successful when applying for Contaminated Site services effectively. We'll describe what you must know before you apply for services, the circumstances when you must apply, and the details of how to use the Contaminated Site services application form. Today, we'll provide you with the tips to help you avoid some common errors and omissions when completing your applications for services. We'll explain how to remit fees effectively and equip you with the resources you need to navigate the process in applying for Contaminated Site services effectively and successfully. Heather will start us off with context setting.
Thank you, Lucy. Next slide, please. So to follow up on the brief presentation yesterday that was an overview, today the team is covering applying for services in depth. And for me, I'm going to cover the regulatory oversight by the Site Remediation Program, because it's important to know that BC laws require persons responsible for contamination to clean it up. The land remediation section does not clean up a contaminated site itself. Rather, the program regulates the cleanup of contaminated sites by parties who are responsible for the contamination. These parties can be triggered into the contaminated site's legal framework by the activities that have been conducted on the property. The program is built to review complex scientific and engineering reports regarding contamination and any potential effects that contamination has on human health and the environment. A decision from the ministry about an aspect of site remediation is sought via an applications-based system. The Government of BC supports the polluter pays principle, meaning fees are charged for ministry services that support cleaning up contamination. Ultimately, contaminated sites are cleaned up so that the ministry can confirm the site is safe for the current use and any future uses. Next slide, please, Lucy. So what is an application? It's a request for service from the ministry. The Contaminated Sites framework includes over 30 services offered to support the remediation of sites in BC. An application contains all the necessary information to support the request for a service. Most applications are prepared by qualified professionals, and they're submitted to the director for consideration. A person applies for a service and receives a response, an approval, a decision, a certification document regarding that application. From 2015 to 2019, the ministry received an average of 350 applications per year. But for your info, in 2021, 575 applications were submitted. Of all the services in general, the time to receive an approval or decision ranges between 1 to 18 months, but averages 4 months. Next slide, please, Lucy. Sorry. Let's talk about the life cycle of an application, which has a distinct set of steps. The first step is processing. Applications are screened and reviewed for completeness. A key component is the review of site risk classification information, which is required to be submitted when applying for services as per Protocol 12. If the application is complete, then a team is assigned, and the composition of the team matches the service requested. Next, please. The second step in the life cycle of an application is the queue. This is where applications are waiting, to be picked up. Sorry, one sec. This is where applications are waiting to be picked up by the reviewers or statutory decision maker. The ministry's queue has recently grown, so it's important that clients are aware that it exists. Next, please. Once an application reaches the top of the queue, it is under active review. The length of time that it takes depends on 3 things: the service requested, the completeness of the application, and the quality of the application. Active review can include the drafting of technical opinions, rounds of comments between the applicant and the team or internal to the team, meetings if necessary, and then consideration by the director of all the relevant factors, all the factors. The final stage of an application includes issuing the decision, completing the records, and completing the appropriate invoicing. Next slide, please. A contaminated site moves through these phases on the left in blue. The number of applications is shown by the diamond shape, and the number is cumulatively the highest at the remediation completed stage of the site. However, there are some main endpoints that I wanted to highlight, where applications are made to the ministry, and that may exit the site from the process. For example, when site investigation has been completed, someone may obtain a determination that a site is not contaminated, or a release notice request. When planning remediation, a responsible person might seek an approval in principle of a remediation plan. And when remediation is completed, a client may seek a certificate of compliance. Applications may still need to be submitted if there are ongoing reporting requirements imposed by the director in the AIP or CFC or other document. Next. Of course, as mentioned, there are over 30 contaminated site services. So I wanted to highlight some of the most common types, 3 of them here, of supporting applications. These are shown in the gray boxes on the right. At the completion of site investigation or remediation, local background concentrations may be established or pre-approvals under Protocol 6 may be sought. And clients are able to make requests for consultation with the ministry, either requests for info in writing or for meetings, throughout the phases of a contaminated sites assessment and remediation. Next slide. As the manager accountable for applications for contaminated site services, I wanted to share some highlights of trends from the past year. Themes have included: each application must be complete and standalone. That means submitting a Contaminated Sites Services Application Form, or CSSAF, with each application. That surprises some clients, but the application is moved through the system as a package, and the important information on the CSSAF is only relevant to that one application. Site risk classification is an integral part of the ministry's review. Protocol 12 describes when site risk classification information is triggered, so please follow that. All relevant forms, reports, and fees are part of a complete application. What that means is you cannot put your foot in the door with a partial application. The ministry is unable to keep tracks of pieces of applications over periods of time. Plus, only complete applications are moved forward, and it's upon you to submit a complete application. Areas of confusion that many clients experience. The framework is a fee-for-service model. There's a fee for each service, and you're expected to pay the fee each time with each application. We will cover how to remit fees effectively in this presentation coming up. I already mentioned that a CSSAF is required for each application each time, and Emma, the CSR, and the protocols govern what is in a complete package. Next slide, please. Lastly, it's best if I mention that the biggest impact on the review and consideration of an application is its quality. On the date of application, it must meet the requirements in place. Each application is judged on the information that it contains. Hence, each application must be complete and of sufficient quality to determine if the requirements have been or will be met. The most common gaps in any type of application includes referencing reports not available to the ministry team, not clearly identifying the service being requested, making assumptions without providing rationale, and inferring in a report that it is possible to draw conclusions about a site with a high level of uncertainty and a low degree of confidence. This leads to rounds of comments with the ministry officers and the statutory decision maker. That is until sufficient information or additional work is provided to the ministry. So that concludes my section. Lucy will take it from here with more information on applying for services. Thank you.
When you begin your application journey, your first step is to read the information on the Apply for Services webpage. On this webpage, you will learn what is a complete application for services, when to submit an application for contaminated site services, and finally, a description for how to complete your application and avoid common pitfalls. The answer to the question, when do I apply for contaminated site services, is found in the Act, its regulations and protocols. The duties of the responsible person to remediate contamination are outlined in these materials. In principle, the objective is to bring about an outcome that ultimately protects human health and the environment. An application for a service can be triggered when the responsible person identifies a high-risk site and the director requires the submission of a remedial plan and schedule. Note, site risk must be classified according to Protocol 12. If an applicant wishes to consult with the Ministry, an application to the Ministry is required. Additional requests may include the consideration of an approved professional's recommendation and the potential issuance of certification documents. And an application to the Ministry is required to request the Director to establish a local background concentration. By definition, an application to the Ministry for Contaminated Sites services is considered to be complete when the package includes a Contaminated Sites Services Application Form, CSSAF, an electronic copy of the requirements, the required Ministry forms, reports, figures, and plans in relation to the specific services, fees for services before or after the service is provided. The application will not be successful if any of these elements are missing from the application. Complete applications are queued when the necessary elements are provided. Incomplete applications will be returned to the applicant if one or more components are missing. To prevent delays in the assignment phase of your application, the applicant is responsible to ensure the application is complete. As an example, a complete application for Protocol 4 background substance concentrations in soil includes the following: a CSSAF, a site risk classification report with an exposure pathway questionnaire if applicable as per requirements under Protocol 12, a summary of site condition, SOSC, the Protocol 4 report with analysis in support of recommendation to the Director, and prepaid fees of $5,000 plus tax. Prepayment of fees would apply in this case. The fees for a request for these services are found in the fee schedule in the Contaminated Sites regulation. Flat fees are prepaid fees. The GST of 5% is applied unless the applicant qualifies for an exemption according to federal tax laws. The complete Protocol 6 application has the same key common elements of the CSSAF, the SRCR, and exposure pathway questionnaire, if applicable, as per requirements under Protocol 12. The Protocol 6 application form is unique to a request for a Protocol 6 pre-approval and must accompany the report. A separate cover letter is appreciated. Instead of prepaid fees, the client is invoiced after the service is provided. According to the regulations, the Ministry charges for the case file reviewer's time an hourly rate of $165 and any expenses incurred during the review. Another important example is an application for site risk reclassification. Under Protocol 12, Site Risk Classification, Section 6, the requirements of a complete submission must include, at a minimum, again, the CSSAF, an updated SRCR, a confirmation of remediation of high-risk conditions in the form of a confirmation of remediation report, performance verification plan, if applicable, the summary site condition and its associated fee of $2,000 and tax. Most of these forms must be signed by an approved professional, as indicated in Protocol 12 and the CSR. More information is also needed. So on to the next slide, please. There are additional requirements for reclassification of a high-risk site to non-high risk, where a risk assessment approach is applied to remediate the contamination at a site. They include a detailed site investigation report, DSI, and a human health and ecological risk assessment, HHERA, as the confirmation of remediation report, plus the associated fees. In both approaches, it is always important to note that the Director has the authority to impose further requirements to submit forms or reports. and associated fees at any stage in the case file review and consideration of the decision. Now that we've gone through some common application examples, let's discuss the two routes of applications. Applications for services are routed to the ministry in two ways according to the service type and site risk classification of a site. Among other services, pre-approvals for non-high-risk sites and applications for services related to high-risk sites prepared by qualified professionals are submitted directly to the ministry for screening and assignment to the ministry team. Non-high-risk site applications from qualified professionals are reviewed by numerical standards or risk-based standards approved professional who sends their recommendation to the statutory decision maker through the CSAP Society. In this schematic, we differentiate the two review processes: ministry review process on the left and the CSAP Society process on the right. CSAP Society is the ministry service delivery partner. Applications for services for non-high-risk and high-risk sites, such as Protocol 12 review or certification documents prepared by qualified professionals, are submitted directly to the ministry for screening and assignment to the ministry team. Conversely, non-high-risk applications such as preliminary and final determination of contamination from a qualified professional are reviewed by an approved professional. In this way, a recommendation to the ministry statutory decision maker comes from the CSAP Society. It's the role of the CSAP Society to screen for completeness. Once the submission passes the CSAP Society preliminary and detailed screening, the complete application with a recommendation of an approved professional is sent to the ministry for assignment to a statutory decision maker. The final decision is issued when rounds of discussion between the statutory decision maker, qualified professional, approved professional, and/or responsible persons has concluded. Lastly, at the conclusion of the review, the client is invoiced for hours spent above hourly credits. Where there are prepaid fees, the application is closed after a decision is issued. Applications are only closed when a record of payment is received by the Minister of Finance. In the second half of this presentation, Colleen Delaney will briefly speak to the review of specific reports by CSAP Society on behalf of the ministry. In addition, Tara Siemens-Kennedy, who is head of the CSAP Society's Detailed Screening Committee, will speak to the topic of reducing errors and omissions in applications submitted to the CSAP Society in Learning Series 16. Now I'll introduce the ABC, D, and E to submit an effective application. A, consult the Apply for Services webpage for current information on application requirements and procedures. B, build out your Contaminated Sites Services application form. C, calculate fees. Understand that fees for Contaminated Site Services will be collected and/or invoiced as per Schedule 3 of the CSR. D is deliver an electronic copy of your application to the ministry for consideration according to the instructions on the Apply for Services webpage. Next slide. The Apply for Services webpage is your information destination for linkages to important documents, including the Contaminated Site Services Form, Site Risk Classification Report, Protocol 6 Pre-Approval, and other required site remediation forms. Here you'll find the directions for how to fill out the Contaminated Site Services Form. You'll see which is the correct destination addresses for your application. You'll learn where there is a requirement for the summary of site condition report, as well as links to the regulation fee schedule. Please note that the legislative requirements in the Environmental Management Act or its regulations inform the content on this webpage. If there are discrepancies, the Act, regulations, and protocols apply. Next slide. I want to recognize that our clients are facing unique challenges during the global pandemic. And one change that has been in place for nearly 2 years now is that applications are to be submitted in electronic format. Although we specifically request electronic records, there may be instances where the ministry requires paper copies of a report, table, or plan. You will be contacted if a paper copy is needed. We recommend using a file transfer protocol site to deliver application documents. Please select an FTP site that does not require the ministry to create an account or enter a password. After you read and understand the instructions on the Apply for Services webpage, you want to begin to build out your application. A link to the CSAP online smart form and other related forms is found on the Apply for Services webpage. Please note the old form has been retired, and only the smart form version is acceptable with applications for contaminated site services. A full set of instructions for how to fill in the form is provided there for guidance. I think you will find the smart form version of the Contaminated Site Services form easy to use and intuitive. From sections 1 to 8, you'll be prompted to complete the fields with a red asterisk before you move on to the next relevant section on the form. It will be easily identifiable what sections are important for your application, and it will inform you what are the components you will need to attach to your application to pass the screening process. The application will not save if a required element on the form is incomplete. The more information you provide on the form will help us understand who our clients are and how to improve our business practices to support you better. When the form is complete, you may save the form as a PDF to send electronically with your application. For some of you attending this workshop today, this may be the first time you've seen the new Contaminated Sites Services application smart form format. The smart form is designed to help you become successful in this first step of applying for Contaminated Site Services. The format will prompt you as you make your way through 8 sections, asking you to complete key pieces of information in each section. Section 1, applicant information, is the person submitting the form and documents to the ministry. The applicant is the responsible person under the Act and regulations. Completion of Section 2, billing contact accurately, will help the ministry with prompt invoice preparation and delivery. In this section, the applicant indicates if they qualify for a GST exemption, a designation under federal law. When different than application is selected, a drop-down menu appears that must be completed in its entirety to continue in the application process. Where the billing contact is different from the applicant, please complete all fields with an asterisk. We encourage applicants to consider using an accounts payable department email if possible. A ministry invoice will be sent to this email account and the business contact is responsible for payment. If a project number is provided, it will appear on the government-issued invoice. Please add the email addresses of all additional invoice recipients in the additional emails to CC on invoices field. An accurate entry in this section will help us avoid a scenario where a billing contact has relocated and interest continues to accrue on the unpaid principal amount. More detailed instructions concerning invoices and remitting fees will come later in this presentation. At times, the owner and operator are different individuals or organizations. In Section 3, where this applies to your application, select different owner and/or operator and complete the required fields in this window. Next slide. Proceeding to Section 4, please add the names and addresses and organization of all qualified professionals and/or approved professionals. Where there are more than one AP or QP, you will be prompted to add this information in the form. At the bottom, Section 4, flag additional APs or QPs. Please enter all the information into the fields provided for each additional person. To serve our clients and respond to the needs of our stakeholders, we would like to know who our clients are. To do so, we must rely on you to add the names of all property owners and operators, qualified professionals, and approved professionals in Sections 3 and 4, respectively. Next slide. Okay, now that we're back, I'll continue with how to fill out the CSSAF in Section 5. Section 5, Application Information, is the core of the Contaminated Site Services application form. There are 7 categories of services and include a few of the following. 5.1, requests for services relating to site identification, site disclosure statements, or site releases. 5.4, requests for certification document applications, or Section 5.7, application for other services and functions. You must select at least one of these services to complete your application. From a drop-down menu, you may select from these 7 categories of service requests. One feature I'd like to bring to your attention is the service requested header. Here, you may review a summary list of your selected service categories displayed in blueprint. To deselect a service, simply toggle the radio button on a service request line. Please note that if you deselect a service category, any information you entered there will disappear, and a clean view will be presented if you reopen that category once more. It's important to know that a CSSAF for applications specifically related to site identification, site disclosure statements selected in Section 5.1 are submitted to the generic inbox site ID at gov.bc.ca for processing. Applications for this service request will be returned to the applicant if they are submitted to the Client Information Officer email address. Under Section 5.2, Report Reviews, applicants may select from multiple report types to accompany their application. Each report review type is a targeted service. For the purpose of this presentation, I've chosen option 5.2.2, Investigation Required by Director. A report submitted under this subsection relates to reports submitted as a requirement imposed by the Director. Where the interim report is required under Protocol 12, select all the types of reports that apply. I provided a screenshot where all options are selected and appear in Blueprint. Enter report titles in the Additional Report Titles field and the Report Title field under Site Investigation before proceeding to another section in the form. From the Protocol menu in Section 5.5, you may select one or more categories of protocols. Each of them have drop-down menus that provide greater details. If we select 5.5.2, pre-approvals under Protocol 6, the following set of fields are presented. For applications where the request for an approval of the Director not to delineate the full extent of contamination, you'll be required to include the reason for this request before you progress to the final entries in Section 6, 7, and 8. Applicants who wish to consult with the Ministry must provide information about the nature of the request in Section 5.7. There is a space provided for additional information to help us process your application, but applications will only be considered complete when the form is attached to a separate detailed agenda. An email request with these 2 items will be considered complete and processed. In Section 6, Review Process Requested and Resubmission, applicants will need to select the review process we discussed in an earlier slide. Either submit to the Ministry or through the CSAP Society. Applications for contaminated site services are specific to a property in a province, and each is classified according to risk conditions at the site. Section 7 is the area on the SMART form to enter site details and site risk classification information. In Section 7.1, enter the site ID, the site registry identification number, if it's known at the time of the application. This is a common omission in application forms submitted to the Ministry. A search of the site registry through BC Online is your source for this information and should be entered here. Enter the latitude and longitude coordinates for the centroid point of the site and select the applicable land ownership. In Section 7.2, the applicant must indicate whether they meet the requirement of Protocol 12 and ensure that either a new or updated site risk classification report has been included with their application. An indication of the site risk classification at the site of the application must be indicated in this section. Section 7.2 informs applicants that in order to meet the requirements of Protocol 12, a site risk classification report should be attached to all applications for contaminated site services. There are 3 exemption circumstances under Protocol 12. Site release requests under Scenario 1, applications for a determination of contamination, and where the SRCR was submitted within the past 5 years and the site risk conditions are unchanged. In this case, the applicant is required to enter the date of the most recent site risk classification report. To complete the form in Section 8, please make the declaration that the information you have provided is true at the time you completed the form and add a signature. The declaration indicates to the Ministry that the name of the billing contact assumes the responsibility to pay the associated fees. Once these 2 areas are complete, please save the document as a PDF and attach to your application. I'm going to hand off to Gayla now to cover remitting fees effectively.
Thank you, Lucy. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about remitting fees effectively. There's 2 different paths for fees, prepaid or postpaid. Some services must be prepaid before the application is placed into the Ministry's queue. In this case, the billing contact will receive the invoice for all applicable fees by email, and only when those fees are remitted will the application be queued. Other fees are paid after the decision or the service is provided. An invoice is issued by the Ministry following the decision or a meeting. It is important that the billing contact information is up to date to ensure invoices are directed to the correct client. Next slide. The Ministry collects fees according to the Contaminated Sites Regulation, or the CSR. Here are some common examples. Prepaid fees include review of detailed risk assessments to support a site risk reclassification or approval in principle, request of a certificate of compliance and the supporting reports such as a confirmation of remediation report, a review of any submitted summary of site condition forms, or establishing local background concentrations. Note, the Ministry's professional reliance model includes applications being routed through the CSAP Society, and CSAP accepts the checks for the Ministry fees on behalf of the Ministry. This is still a prepaid service. CSAP passes those fees for services on to the Ministry with the transmitted application package. The Ministry then sends those checks to the Ministry of Finance. For all other situations, clients remit the fees to the Ministry of Finance themselves to pay an issued invoice. Next, examples of fees that are invoiced after the service is completed include pre-approvals under Protocol 6, water use determinations under Protocol 21, and meetings with the Ministry. Next, the additional hourly rate for these services are billed at $165 an hour for every hour above the 1 hour credit. Please note that the legislative framework supports the Ministry in charging fees for time and travel costs for items such as site visits or things like annual meetings for high-risk sites. Next slide. You wonder when invoices are sent for the services. We send them out as soon as reasonably possible. Note, though, invoices may not be sent out immediately, but will be after the services have been completed. The Ministry has made improvements in 2021 to achieve invoicing faster. A keynote, reviews can take up to 18 months, so invoices may arrive even several months after that. The Ministry recognizes that business processes can cross fiscal years. Given that, prior to mid-February, it may be possible to request an interim bill for applications under review. If you want to request that, please send an email to the CIO inbox. Next slide. This is a sample portion of an invoice. You can include a copy of the invoice when you submit your payment, or you can reference the invoice number, which is in the top right green box, when payment is submitted. Please note that the due date is within 30 days after the date of the invoice. In this case, the date of the invoice is December 9th, 2021, and so 30 days later means the invoice is due by January 8th, 2022, indicated in the yellow box. Payments must be received by the Ministry of Finance by that date to avoid interest accruing on your account. If an invoice shows as unpaid beyond the 30 days, the Ministry of Finance will mail a monthly statement listing the interest charges applied. Next slide. On the invoice is a description, service description, site ID, and an application number. On the center of the invoice, details are included to explain what type of services are billed. In this case, a Protocol 6 pre-approval, the site identification number 123, application identification number 12345, and the site address 1212 Brownfield Road are provided. The invoice is sent to the attention of the billing contact listed on the CSAP. With the new CSAP field has been added to include a project number. This can now be included in the invoice description to assist you if you are managing multiple projects. Next slide. Invoices, payments, and address updates. The bottom portion of the invoice has the financial services branch address to mail your payment and a copy of your invoice. If you would like to courier your payment, please provide the physical address on the Apply for Services. Please find the physical address on the Apply for Services webpage. Next slide. Payment of invoices are due within 30 days of the invoice being emailed. The first invoice is emailed to the billing contact listed on the CSSAF. The new form has 2 fields for emails. We encourage one of them to be a generic type of accounts payable email, which is always being monitored. Outstanding invoices or interest accrued statements will be mailed to the billing information on the CSSAF form if not paid in full. Interest will be applied to any outstanding balance not received by the invoice due date. The rate of interest shall be 3% plus the prime lending rate of the principal banker to the province. Next slide. Paying fees by check. Fees for direct to ministry services are only paid against an invoice, so the invoice would come first. We have 2 methods to pay fees. Checks payable to the Minister of Finance can be sent to the Ministry of Finance using our PO Box 9356 or by courier to a physical location located at the 4th floor at Jutland Road in Victoria. Checks are provided when submitting applications through the CSAP Society, but they are still made payable to the Minister of Finance. Please note that checks to support recommendations of an approved professional via the CSAP process are sent to the CSAP Society with the application, but the option is also available to pay by electronic funds transfer, or EFT. EFTs take time to complete, however, it does prevent stale dated checks. EFTs have been available for about a year, but many people still submit by check. Next slide. Payment by electronic funds transfer. All invoices are emailed to the billing contact on the CSSAF and will include details to process the payment by EFT. The client must notify our revenue department via email at revenuenrsector@gov.bc.ca of the deposit before it enters the account. EFT instructions are available on the Apply for Services webpage, and they're also attached to the email when we send the invoice. Next slide. Electronic funds transfer requirements. EFTs are free, but take several days to complete. Once we have confirmed that the funds have been deposited, we can apply the payment to your account. The notification email to finance must include certain details such as the client's name, the invoice number that you are paying, the amount, and the date of the deposit. If the client fails to notify our revenue department, the risk is that the payment may not get applied and the invoice will remain as outstanding. As mentioned before, payments are to be received by the invoice due date to avoid the interest charges. Next slide, please. Undelivered invoices. We would like to stress the importance of receiving a completed CSSAF with the correct billing information. This would include the company's name, mailing address, email, contact, and a generic one. Billing contacts may change as the employees change positions or leave a company. If the employee or applicant has left the project or the company, the invoice will not be delivered by email, and the company will not realize an invoice has been sent until the invoice due date has passed and the outstanding fee statement from the Ministry of Finance has been mailed with the interest charges applied. Next slide, please. We highly encourage applicants to use an accounts payable email address and include any other recipients on the CSSAF for billing purposes. This will ensure the invoices will be paid and not be misdirected. I will now pass you back to Lucy.
Thank you, Gayla. The Client Information Officer and the Ministry have observed a few common errors and omissions with applications for contaminated site services that we'd like to bring these to your attention. It may help you to know that what they are and how to avoid them when it comes time to submit your next request. Omission and errors on the CSSAF include the current site ID and PID information should be entered carefully, entering the correct latitude and longitude coordinates for the centroid point of the site and the current billing contact information, email addresses. Missing forms in the application package. It will help with the screening process when an application comes with all the necessary forms attached the first time. The Apply for Services webpage is where you will find all the information about when to submit an SRCR EPQ, when to submit the summary site condition, as well as links to these forms and the Protocol 6 pre-approval application form. Please do not combine documents and forms into one file. For processing purposes, we request documents and forms are emailed to the appropriate email inbox as individual files. The naming convention is issue date, site ID, report type. Another reminder to applicants, please include a CSSAF and a formal agenda with every request for consultation. We'll be better prepared to put the best team in place to respond to your request if we know the details around your investigation. As Gail mentioned, before you remit payment, please wait for an official ministry invoice. There are services that are invoiced and paid before the application is assigned, and also fees that are invoiced when the review has completed. Payments are applied to the invoice number at the Ministry of Finance. All of this is outlined for you on the Apply for Services webpage. Lastly, the client information officers would like applicants to direct application forms and documents to the correct email account for processing. Applications to the Ministry with a CSSAF are forwarded to the client information officer address. Notices of off-site migration or notices of independent remediation are directed to the Site Information Advisor. And the site disclosure statements are directed to the Site Identification email inbox. Please visit the Contact Us webpage if you are unsure which is the correct destination email account to use. Each of these reminders will help you be successful with preparing a complete application effectively. There are several ministry application forms and a number of ministry emails to use, but to help you further, the ministry has improved our messaging for applicants in 3 ways. The Apply for Services webpage is up to date with how and where to submit applications for contaminated site services. The site identification and requesting a release notice webpage have information about submitting SDSs and applications for release notices. Visit the Contact Us webpage for email addresses and descriptions regarding where to submit applications, or when you have an inquiry related to a specific subject or form. That is the best way to access ministry services. Also, you should access the Site Remediation News webpage for announcements on recent presentations, as well as changes in procedures or policy. Then the CSAP Society webpage is a great resource too. Colleen Delaney, Senior Professional Reliance Officer, will now speak briefly on the new report review services that the CSAP Society is now providing. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Lucy. As many of you may have seen at the January 12th webinar jointly presented by the Ministry and the CSAP Society, there is a new report review process that was implemented January 31st, 2022 within the Contaminated Sites framework. The select reports that are now to be sent directly to the CSAP Society for screening and review by the Review Services Committee are those reports and statements that must be submitted to meet a director's imposed requirement on a non-high-risk site. These reports often relate to the conditions of a certificate of compliance or an approval in principle. This expanded review service by CSAP does not relate to the site identification process. Please continue sending these reports and annual updates for the site ID process to siteid@gov.bc.ca. Next slide, please. Here is a brief overview of what we see as a 5-step process. Next, please. On behalf of the responsible person, a consultant would review the ministry certification documents or legal instruments, for example, an AIP or a COC, that have been issued for the site to determine whether a report is to be submitted to support a director's requirement. They would then prepare the appropriate statement or report. Next, please. This process commenced January 31st, 2022. As of that date, all relevant reports are to be submitted to CSAP for review. Next, please. CSAP will screen and review the information package that is submitted instead of the ministry. Next, please. The CSAP Review Services Committee, or RSC, will conduct a review and prepare a package for the director to consider. The director will then consider whether the application has met the intention of the director's requirement. Next, please. Finally, a response letter will be drafted and issued by the director to the responsible person. As you can see, the director considers the report that supports a requirement and provides a response to the applicant about that report. To sum it up, CSAP processes the application and CSAP's committee conducts the review, and the statutory decision-making remains with the ministry. This brings us to the end of our presentation on applying for services.
Thank you. In summary, we recommend three things to remember the next time you apply for Contaminated Site services. Become familiar with the Apply for Services webpage as your source for up-to-date information on submission requirements. Only complete applications will be considered for ministry review. I would recommend to watch for and correct common errors and omissions. Remember to sign and attach all relevant forms and be prepared to remit the appropriate applicable fees against an invoice. And finally, the best strategy for success when applying for Contaminated Site services will be to send us your best work. Clear conclusions based on sound data is our expectation when making statutory decisions. Your efforts will result in achieving the best outcome for your client and ultimately human health and the environment. Thank you so much.